Carbon capture and storage, or short CCS, describes the idea to take CO2 from emission sources and store it underground in geological formation so it does not escape into the atmosphere and does not contribute to climate change. What I often observe is that people have ideas about CCS that do not match reality, and there are many misconceptions about it. CCS is a very controversial topic. You will have some people who are more positive towards it, who will say it's an important tool to fight climate change and we need all tools. They may say that it's needed for industries like cement, where we don't really have any alternative to it. And they may also say that it has been successfully used for many decades in projects, for example, in Norway or in the United States. On the other hand, people who are more critical or opposed to CCS may say that it's mostly a distraction by the fossil fuel industry, that claims in the past that something is CCS ready have been empty promises, and that it's largely an untested technology. I would say that all of these arguments have some truth to it. And I want to specifically pick out one claim from each of them, and those two claims seem to be contradicting each other. Some people say that it has been used successfully for a long time, and on the other hand, that people say it's largely untested. Both are in some sense true, because it's important to ask what kind of CCS are we really talking about. From many discussions, I experienced that people have certain ideas about CCS, what they think it looks like. One idea people may have is that you have, for example, a gas-fired power plant that, of course, emits CO2 from fossil fuels. And then you might install a capture unit that takes the CO2 and then puts it underground into a geological storage site. If you really want to do that, that would be a lot more complicated and would require a lot of additional technology. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that this scenario currently does not exist. There's no gas-fired power plant anywhere in the world where anything like this has been implemented. There have only been a few small trials, but this is not something that is done in a real industrial setting. Another idea many people associate with carbon capture and storage is that you would pull CO2 out of the air, this is so-called direct air capture, and then store that underground. And this only exists in really, really small quantities. There's one company called Climeworks that has 2 such installations in Iceland, but there have been some recent reports that even the low amounts of CO2 they are trying to capture, they are not even close to reaching that numbers. There are some existing CCS projects, but how do they look like? We first have to talk about something called enhanced oil recovery, or short EOR. Already back in the 1950s, oil companies were wondering what they could do to get more oil out of aging oil fields. One possibility is to inject something into the oil field that will mobilize remaining oil that is still trapped there and therefore increase the yield of these old oil fields. And it turns out that CO2 works very well to do this, so oil companies started injecting CO2 into these oil fields. Where do you get that CO2 from? You may say that shouldn't be a problem. Oil companies are kinda experts in creating CO2, but it actually is a problem because you may not have the CO2 at the right location, or you may not have it in the right concentration or the right purity. And therefore, the most common way oil companies do this is by actually drilling for CO2. There are so-called natural CO2 sources, and they drill for it like they would otherwise drill for fossil gas. And then they inject that into an oil field to increase the yield, and that is called enhanced oil recovery. Now you may of course wonder, how does any of this help the climate? Weren't we talking about a technology that should mitigate climate change? Doing enhanced oil recovery where you put CO2 out of the ground to just drill more oil doesn't do anything to decrease emissions. these so-called natural CO2 sources are not the only sources used for enhanced oil recovery. When fossil gas is taken out of the ground, it is a mixture of different gases. The main component is methane, which is what gives it the energy, but it is usually mixed with CO2 and some other gases. Before it can be fed into a gas grid, it needs to be upgraded. So these gas upgraders separate the CO2 out, and this CO2 can also be used for enhanced oil recovery. And it is a relatively concentrated CO2 source and is very suitable for that. So this is also commonly done. At some point, the oil companies said, hey, what we're doing here, that is actually helping the climate, because that CO2, otherwise we would emit it into the atmosphere, but now we're putting it underground for enhanced oil recovery, and therefore we're doing something good, right? And so the oil companies said we should get subsidies for this. In the United States, there is something called 45Q, which is a tax break for such projects. The oil companies can profit from that if they inject this CO2 coming out of these gas upgraders or also some other emission sources into the ground. The first big takeaway here is that today most CO2 storage that is happening is in enhanced oil recovery. Other CO2 storage is, compared to that, small. And the other takeaway is that most CO2 capture these days is at these gas upgraders. It is CO2 that is coming together with fossil gas that is then used for this enhanced oil recovery. And by the way, even more CO2 is taken from these so-called natural CO2 fields, but that is not really part of CCS. What you can see here is a report from the Global CCS Institute, so that's basically the CCS lobbying organization, and they have a list of active CCS projects in their yearly report. If you look here in the column in the middle, you can see that there's a lot of natural gas processing, which is these gas upgraders that I just mentioned. There's also some stuff that is from the chemical industry, for example, ammonia production and some other chemicals. There's also a reason for that, and I'll come to that. And in the right column, you see where the CO2 is stored, and you can also see that the majority is enhanced oil recovery, and particularly the larger projects are usually enhanced oil recovery. That these projects use enhanced oil recovery is relatively obvious because it gives them an additional income, although it would be more beneficial for the climate if they would just store the CO2 without increasing oil production. It's less obvious why these gas upgraders are such a popular source of CO2, because there are many possible sources of CO2. Every power plant, every industrial installation could be used as a CO2 source. And the reason why these gas upgraders are so popular for these projects is that they have a high CO2 concentration. Once you separate out CO2 from the fossil gas, which has to happen anyway, you have a waste stream that is very concentrated. Compared to that, if you look, for example, to a power plant, there's CO2, but there are also a lot of other gases. The most important one is nitrogen. This is just because nitrogen is the main component of our air. And if you burn something, you usually burn it in air. Then you also have oxygen, you have water vapor, and you have carbon dioxide, but in a relatively small concentration. And then you have some other gases like pollutants from the combustion. If you want to do CCS on something like a power plant, that is so-called post-combustion CCS, you usually use a technology that is called amine scrubbing, which is also sometimes used in these gas upgraders, but there it's not used for CCS, but there it's used to separate the CO2 from the methane. And this is something that is very important to understand. The lower your CO2 concentration is, the higher the costs are, because these processes also take a lot of energy. If you want to separate small amounts of CO2 from a waste gas stream, that just costs more. If we look at different kinds of CO2 sources and order them by their CO2 concentration, we see something like this. On the upper end, we have these gas upgraders, and also something very similar are biomethane upgraders, which is kind of the renewable energy version of that. And I have recently written a text about that I will link in the description. You also have certain processes in the chemical industry that generate relatively high amounts of CO2, but there it gets a bit complicated. For example, in hydrogen and ammonia production, you have some sources of CO2 that are highly concentrated, but you have others that have a very low concentration. This is particularly important if you talk about so-called blue hydrogen, where you often have a situation where capturing some CO2 is cheap, but getting to a high capture rate is very expensive. Then you have things like cement, which is kind of in the middle. At the lower end, you have things like power plants, for example, coal power plants or also waste-to-energy plants. And even lower are gas power plants. They have a particularly low concentration of CO2. The absolutely lowest is, of course, our atmosphere. If you're trying to get CO2 out of the atmosphere with so-called direct air capture, that is the most expensive option. And overall, you can see that most existing CCS projects and also EOR projects, whether you want to count them or not, tend to use the cheapest CO2 sources available. That is, of course, not surprising, but it is important to keep in mind because when people discuss CCS, they often talk about power plants, they talk about industrial facilities, and these are often sources where it's much more expensive to capture the CO2, and it's also not really comparable to these CCS projects that already exist. A few important takeaways here. Most existing CO2 storage is for enhanced oil recovery. If people say that there are already successful CCS projects, most of them are not primarily to avoid CO2 emissions, they are to increase oil production. Most CO2 capture these days comes from these fossil gas upgraders. And that is because they provide already a high concentration of CO2, so it is cheaper to capture there. And it's not really comparable to something like capturing CO2 from a power plant. And that is really, I think, the most important takeaway. The lower the CO2 concentration, the higher the costs are. If you enjoyed this video, of course, I would appreciate if you give it a like or if you subscribe to the channel. I also am writing a newsletter about these topics and you can subscribe to it for free.